Great. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Fjäder, and I do come from the National Emergency Supply Agency. You think that's complicated to pronounce? Try the Swedish version right down here. I'm not going to embarrass myself because I should be able to do that, but just in case I'm nervous and my nerves give away, I could actually make a mistake as well. So I won't go there. Okay, just a few words about myself. Before I get started with this speech. I've been with NESA only for about a year and a half now, so I joined in August 2012. I've got a bit of a split personality in terms of background, I suppose. I got corporate experience mainly from Asia Pacific and from global roles in business continuity management, risk management, and corporate security. But on the other hand, I also have a background, or my academic background is from international relations, where my specialty was actually East Asian and Southeast Asian regionalism. So, not sure what the relationship is with security of supply, but perhaps during this talk we'll find some commonalities there after all. Right, okay. So what I'm planning to talk about today is just to give you a very brief introduction to security of supply. I'm not planning to do a general lecture on it, but rather talk a little bit about the objectives of security of supply, especially as it relates to humanitarian logistics. Then I'm going to talk just a little bit about the international cooperation we do at the moment, perhaps highlight some of its shortcomings and areas for further development, as well as then hopefully give some ideas in terms of where we would have commonalities or common interest with humanitarian logistics. And really the last part, I'm focusing especially on that in terms of trying to come up with some ideas where the future of cooperation between ourselves and institutes such as HUMLOG and others could be. Okay, so just very briefly, what's security of supply? Finland probably has a slightly different definition of security of supply than from other countries. So I'm going to just go very briefly through in terms of how we see it and what it consists of in our daily operations. I think what's really significant here is that the objective is really the well-being of the population. And through securing the vital sort of needs that the population needs to survive. So in a sort of worst case scenario, I would actually propose that the objective is pretty much exactly the same as with humanitarian logistics. It's just that we have the benefit of being proactive and actually planning this well beforehand, whereas I guess humanitarian logistics is more needs-based, more urgency-based than security of supply. But in the end of the day, the objective is the same. So what it consists of is basically three major areas. First of all, functioning of the economy and having the sort of ability to secure, or rather securing the economy's ability to produce vital goods and services. In countries such as Finland, most of the vital goods and services are in fact produced by the private sector. And our job is basically to ensure that they have the infrastructure, the working infrastructure to do so, and then some specific arrangements that I come to shortly. But the critical infrastructure really is what enables the delivery of these goods and services to the people, so it is an important component of all of this. And then there's, of course, in case of especially the worst case, national defense, which mainly relies on the same resources as the civilian sector or the civil society. Okay, so just in terms of a bit how these different components relate to each other, obviously we concern ourselves of having access to critical materials and goods that are required to feed the people, keep people warm, and to have essential things like electricity that basically enables everything nowadays. Critical production to actually produce those goods and services, critical infrastructure that really gives that sort of platform for doing so, and then logistics actually throughout the process. Obviously, logistics applies when we want to get the critical materials in, when we want to distribute them to production, and then to the end users or the consumers in the end. So all coming together nicely, we have security of supply. In terms of available strategies, and this relates fairly directly to international cooperation or motivation for international cooperation, is that we have two sort of broad alternative strategies that we can apply. Reducing dependency on outsiders or securing supply. In terms of reducing dependency, we can achieve this through stockpiling those critical materials and goods, for instance, kind of isolating ourselves from the outside world. We can attempt to secure critical production and services. Again, this has to happen in terms of the business and in terms of the economy, but nonetheless, we have this option as well. And then finally, there's the option of domestic and state ownership, which I would propose we only should use when it's absolutely necessary. Then the other option, broad option, is strategic option, is actually securing access to global supply chains. Most of our economy, again, depends on inputs from the global supply chain. So instead of, or perhaps as complementary to stockpiling, for instance, and having this sort of domestic capability, we can try to attempt to make sure that we can extract what we need from the global supply chains. And this is mainly done through logistic preparedness and continuity management, seeking to find alternative routes and sources for these goods and materials, and through international agreements and international cooperation. So why do we want to emphasize international cooperation in security of supply? Well, again, like I said, obviously we depend on the global supply chain, but Finland is actually quite an isolated country in sort of geographical terms. About 80% of our trading goods actually takes the sea route via the Baltic Sea. So we have this sort of inherent vulnerability there. There fortunately hasn't been crisis in the Baltic Sea, but in the worst case, should there be a combination of different type of crisis and disasters, there's a theoretical chance that we might get blocked from these global supply chains. And to ensure that if this happen, we can still survive, we need to cooperate with others. I think that's pretty much the bottom line. In terms of the international cooperation we do at the moment, I kind of divide it into 4 different major categories. The EU, obviously, as an EU member, the EU actually puts a lot of restraints and capabilities into our international cooperation. We do some multilateral cooperation as well. Then we have NATO Partnership for Peace cooperation. We have some bilateral cooperation, mainly with our neighbors, and we have some Nordic cooperation. I'll just take you through very quickly in terms of what's going on at the moment and how do I see that these should actually be developed going into the future. Right, so multilateral and European Union cooperation is mostly, again, of course, treaty and obligations based. Most of it concerns security of supply in oil and gas. There's to a limited extent some of the other areas are covered as well, but again, for instance, community legislation really just concerns the security supply of oil and gas and provides obligations to the member countries to hold stock of oil products and crude oil for at least 90 days of net imports. this kind of sets the baseline for our stockpiling in these products as well. Then there's a number of cooperation relating to critical infrastructure protection going on. But for the most part, this is quite limited as well and mostly focuses on energy and transport at the moment. There's been talk and initiatives to extend this cooperation, and especially after the H1N1 pandemic, for instance, there was discussion that maybe the EU countries should cooperate in also critical medical goods. But this hasn't really gone anywhere. I think in general, so again, this is useful, but very limited in lots of ways. Then the NATO cooperation, obviously, Finland participates in this within the context of Finland's agreement for partnership for peace. Since we're not members, there are certain restraints in terms of where and how this could be operationalized, but in general, the cooperation is perhaps a bit broader. So it is quite useful and covers a lot more areas, including, for instance, telecommunication, medical care, which was missing from the European side, and food and agriculture as an example. But really, of course, you can ask again, what kind of utility this would have in the worst case, because we are not members. Nordic cooperation is quite natural for Finland, of course, and Finland is active in Nordic cooperation. Again, the cooperation is a little bit broader than maybe in the EU context, but maybe not as broad as in NATO context. We have some limited cooperation in terms of military supplies, emergency-specific pharmaceuticals. But for instance, as far as I know, at least, this doesn't also cover, for instance, pandemic medications and things of this nature. One of the strong areas is really energy-related and electricity supply preparedness and security supply in the energy sector. I think one of the, again, so this is sort of a natural form of cooperation for us, but of course one of the limitations again is that with the exception of Finland, Sweden, the other Nordic countries are NATO members. So if we think in terms of the exceptional circumstances, I'm not sure how that would actually work in real life. But in business as usual or preparing for more sort of normal time disruptions, of course, it's very, very useful. We have also some, to be exact, two bilateral agreements, both of which are more sort of framework agreement type of agreements, as opposed to being very specific. The agreement with Sweden is a little bit more specific. It actually it was signed in '92, and it actually defined critical products that we would cooperate in if there was an international crisis that would concern both or one or the other. The problem, I think the main challenge with this is it hasn't really been updated since very much at all. And at the same time, obviously, the world has moved on quite a bit since 1992. So again, how this would work in the sort of real worst-case situation, not so sure. The agreement with Norway is definitely even more sort of generic, and really is just a framework agreement that sets the scene for having sector-specific arrangements or agreements. So it's really sort of a fairly broad framework agreement. And again, of course, because Norway is a NATO member, and Finland is an EU member, which Norway isn't, there are restrictions on both sides in terms of what we can agree upon. There's some stockpiling arrangements also in the Baltic region with Denmark, Estonia, Latvia, and Sweden. And we have explored some cooperation with a number of other countries as well, but there's nothing really formal in terms of agreements there at the moment. that of course it's an issue that I think should be constantly updated and rethought as the world changes. Right, so what are the main challenges with this setup? I think first and foremost, again, we pay a lot of lip service on global dependency, how much we depend on global supply chains, but most of our international cooperation is actually focusing on the near region or then the region. So basically the Nordics, the Baltic, and the broadest, the European Union. The other sort of challenge is a logical one, I think, because we generally claim to prepare for both disruptions during so-called normal or business as usual conditions, as well as under exceptional circumstances, sort of broader crisis, even war. But really the cooperation, or at least the agreements, are definitely more focused on this exceptional end of the range. And speaking of exceptional, again, if we prepare for the worst case with these agreements, how do we know how this will actually be operationalized during the worst case situation because of these boundaries that they have built into them, and plus because some of them are not up to date, to be quite honest. So there's certainly, I think, a lot to do here. And I'm going to be soon moving on into how do I see and what I would propose that should be done. But just the final thing, I suppose, is that this is all intergovernmental. And yet, most of these services, most of the things we need are actually produced by the private sector. So I think there's a blank spot here missing. We have a strong tradition within Finland in public-private partnership, but that really doesn't, in a meaningful manner at least, extend beyond our territory or the national context. Okay, so what we should do, and I think again this applies probably, or this has been already brought up a little bit, is I think first of all extending the public-private partnership beyond the national context. So really thinking and trying to identify sort of innovative partnerships with NGOs, with international organizations and multinational companies such as logistics companies and other governments as well, of course. But even better if we could have these multi-stakeholder networks that come together in terms of providing solutions to these common problems together. So, and then more from operational point of view, again, we would have opportunities, I think, to seek efficiencies in stockpiling through sort of through international cooperation in terms of pooling and sharing type of arrangements. Or then we could think about having stockpiles also outside the territory, as long as we can secure access to these stockpiles. Okay, but again, like I think I mentioned earlier, I think there's some inherent differences between security supply and humanitarian logistics, but there are also a lot of commonalities. And the deeper we go into the sort of baseline, I think the closer these come together. First of all, if you think in terms of the three challenges together, we both need to think about how to get the right goods to the right people at the right time. But I think that we clearly have that in common. How would we get to there? Again, we need to determine what people really need, how much they need it, and when they need it. This varies so much depending from situation to situation that we should really increase, I think, the capability to do this in a more targeted manner. And then lastly, determining how to get it to them. I think all these three things need to be fulfilled before we can really talk about efficiency, whether it's security of supply or humanitarian logistics. Just before I finish, and again, it's good to see that I think we are in line in terms of what the research ideas could be for the future. I think this first bit here in terms of combining open data
crowdsourcing and geolocation services in terms of gathering data about the needs of people and their circumstances, whether it's about the geographic circumstances, the weather, or whether it's their individual circumstances. And in this regard, I especially refer to crowdsourcing. In this day and age of mobile technology, for instance, and mobile technology being more available to more people, even in emerging developing countries, there is probably information out there that we could have access to and we don't have at the moment. When you combine this with supply chain analytics, again, maybe we're getting closer to those three sort of determinants of success here. So if we really have a better understanding what people need, how much, when, and where, and then through supply chain analytics, we establish where we can get it from, how we can get it to them most efficiently. I think we're really going to get somewhere. Then I think in terms of operational efficiency, again, we should probably look into even more. There's, of course, a lot of good work being done, but even more towards finding innovative ways of locating and delivering these goods. And like I said, this sort of multi-stakeholder cooperation between governments, international organizations, NGOs, and agencies such as ourselves would be probably very beneficial to all of us. And really not just beneficial in terms of efficiency to get the right stuff to the right people at the right time, but in terms of also optimizing the cost of these operations. And from our point of view, I think we would be very interested in applications that have been tested in real life. So for instance, in humanitarian logistics operations, and take whatever we can learn from there and use from there to also apply to security supply. And I'm sure we have actually lots of areas where we can learn from each other. But okay, I think I'm going to end here and perhaps open the floor for comments and questions and ideas. Thank you.